The Picos de Europa National Park is a mountainous nature reserve in the northern Spanish region of Cantabria. The park attracts around 3 million visitors a year who come seeking its verdant forests, crystal clear lakes, and majestic snow-capped mountains. However, each of these visitors is issued a stark warning, as the Picos de Europa are known to be every bit as brutal as they are beautiful. During the winter months, freak snowstorms can send temperatures plummeting into the mid-30s, resulting in an extensive list of fatalities and missing persons. The park is also home to Cantabrian brown bears, whose population exploded following a ban on the hunting of the species in the early 70s. The bears aren't known for their aggression towards humans, but along with the wolves and wild boars the park is also home to, they can prove a deadly threat to those caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet, Cantabria isn't just famous for its wild natural beauty, it's also the place where a decades-long mystery was finally brought to a close. But like so many other similar instances, the revelation raised many more questions than it answered. Back in 1945, 31-year-old Eloy Cilio Perez was employed as a forest ranger at the Picos de Europa National Park. He also happened to be the elected mayor of the small nearby town of Shures, which is nationally renowned for its queso de cabrales, a kind of blue cheese matured in the many limestone caves present in the surrounding mountains. But Eloy's life was anything but peaceful or happy. Between 1936 and 1939, Spain had been scorched by the fires of civil war, and by its end, fascist dictator General Franco had declared himself the victor and ruler of all of Spain. With the surrender of anti-fascist forces in the face of a unified far right, the civil war may have officially come to a close, but for much of Spain's Republican resistance, the fight was far from over. They took refuge in the last of the country's wilderness areas, melting into the forests and mountains whenever pursued by Franco's forces, and the region of Picos de Europa was no different. Many of the resistance fighters who sheltered in the park were known to Eloy all his life. Some he'd shared a classroom with during his formative years, others were blood relatives. Meaning, there's no doubt that Eloy had a degree of sympathy for them. However, given he was mayor of Shures, Eloy had certain obligations to his fascist overlords. Essentially, he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. He could betray his country or betray his friends, both of which would result in his death. So instead, it seems Eloy attempted to remain as neutral as possible. He paid just enough lip service to the regime to avoid falling under suspicion while remaining tight-lipped regarding the location of anti-fascist guerrillas in the Picos de Europa. All that mattered to him was keeping the people of Shures safe. One of fascist Spain's primary sponsors had been Germany, but following the Red Army's rush in Berlin and the collapse of Germany's nightmarish reign, the future of Spanish fascism was brought into doubt. With his stranglehold on Eastern Europe assured, Joseph Stalin declared that global revolution would continue indefinitely, fanning the hopes of Marxist insurgents around the world. The guerrillas of Picos Europa were no different, and following the German surrender began immediately stepping up the intensity of their operations. They ambushed units of the Spanish Civil Guard with ever-increasing frequency and even went so far as to seek out ways of producing explosive material. This was an extremely risky move, and in trying to involve the people of Shures in their pursuit of volatile chemicals, the guerrillas risked bringing the full force of fascist retribution down on the small mountain town. This was something that Eloy could not tolerate, and in mid-April of 1945, he sought out a parley with an old friend. Over the next decade, Juan rose through the ranks, receiving multiple battlefield promotions until he found himself second in command of all regional resistance forces. It was under one's deputy leadership that Cantabria saw a sharp uptick in political violence. So, in an attempt to avert a wider conflict, Eloy reached out to his old friend to arrange a meeting. Then, on Sunday, April 5th, 1945, Eloy walked deep into the Picos de Europa wilderness, far from any road or track, to an old abandoned villa being slowly reclaimed by nature. There, Juan and a cadre of his guerrillas were waiting. And after some brief introductions, Eloy began to make his appeal. Franco's overthrow could not come quick enough, he explained, but an escalation of violence risked destroying the very place they called home. Juan and his comrades listened as Eloy made his case until suddenly they heard footsteps coming from outside. 2 days before the meeting was due to take place, Eloy had confided in a fellow park ranger that he was due to meet with the guerrillas. It's clear that Eloy trusted the man enough to share such sensitive information with him, so there's no doubt to believe that he was a government informant. But at the same time, there's no doubt that he would have been terrified that he too might be implicated in the plot. The night before the meeting, Eloy's fellow park ranger betrayed him to the Spanish civil guard. The footsteps Eloy and Juan heard that afternoon didn't belong to more of the guerrillas' anti-fascist comrades, nor did they belong to some innocent hikers who just so happened to have stumbled upon the place. They belonged to a heavily armed troop of the Spanish civil guard, all of whom were intent on slaughtering those present at the meeting. Yet, the guerrillas weren't stupid. There was a reason they'd survived for 6 long years up in the forests and mountains, and when they chose the abandoned villa as their meeting place, they did so because of how easily defensible it was. This meant that when they realized that they'd been discovered by their sworn enemies, they weren't only capable of mounting a defense, they were practically spoiling for a fight. Despite being aware of their location, the guerrillas were able to rush into position and execute an almost perfect ambush on the approaching civil guard. 2 of the fascists were immediately dispatched, and the remaining civil guard were pinned down, picked off, and then forced into a retreat until reinforcements could arrive. The guerrillas used this lull in the fighting to flee the area, but before they did so, they fell upon the bodies of the dead and dying fascists, looting everything they possibly could before making their escape. Eloy ran all the way back to Shures, where the victorious guerrillas melted back into the mountains, vanishing among a network of hidden encampments. Over the days that followed, Eloy waited anxiously for that fateful knock on his front door. The Spanish government had an extensive network of civilian informants, and it seemed only a matter of time before someone would come for him. But when the knock came and Eloy opened his front door, he discovered it was Juan on the doorstep. "Come with me," his old friend said. "We need to talk." In the aftermath of the firefight at the abandoned villa, the anti-fascist guerrillas carried away a great deal of loot from the slain civil guardsmen. One of the fallen guardsmen was an officer because among that loot was a small folded piece of paper with the group's orders written on it. The note named Eloy's fellow park ranger, Alfonso Martinez, as their informant, and it's possible that it mentioned that another unnamed park ranger was the primary source of the information. It's reasonable to believe that in order to preserve the anonymity of a man he was no doubt close to, Alfonso Martinez neglected to name Eloy in his report to the Spanish police. But seeing as the Picos de Europa's ranger team was so small in number, the guerrillas quickly deduced that the primary source was none other than Eloy Cilio Perez. On April 24th, 1945, Eloy was marched up into the mountains to a top-secret guerrilla headquarters and subjected to several rounds of intense interrogation. What happened afterward is a subject of much speculation even today, but a few months later, one captured guerrilla fighter claimed to know the definitive truth, referring to Juan Fernandez Ayala by his nickname, Juanan. The captured gorilla explained that he'd spotted one walking Eloy into the jungle. The parrot seemed relaxed, with Juan assuring his old friend that everything was going to be okay. And then, he'd been forgiven for his accidental transgression. Moments later, a single gunshot was heard, and Juan returned alone. After learning of his death, Eloy's relatives contacted the Spanish police and pleaded with them to bring home his body. Joined by dozens of civilian volunteers, officers conducted extensive searches of the Picos de Europa, but no trace of Eloy could be found. It was hoped that one day Juan Fernandez Ayala might reveal the location of Eloy's body, but it was a secret that he would take to his grave. On April 24th of 1957, 12 years to the day since Eloy's execution, Juan was killed in a shootout with Spanish military police. In the end, Eloy's loved ones grew to accept that, dead or alive, he was never coming home. But in the words of Walt Whitman, nothing is ever really lost. During the summer of 2018, a team of professional cavers was exploring a system of underground passageways on the eastern side of the Picos de Europa, thanks in part to funding from the European Union. The Spanish government hired a group of highly experienced spelunkers to search for the remains of those who had gone missing as a result of both the Spanish Civil War as well as its prolonged and painful aftermath. Eloy Cilio Perez wasn't the only man to go missing in the area, so it's not like the search team was specifically looking for him. But there's no doubt that reports of his disappearance factored into the government's decision to dispatch cavers to the national park. Upon reaching the entrance of a subterranean cave known as the Tour de Topper, the group unpacked their things and prepared to descend almost 200 meters beneath the earth. The climb down took a great deal of care and precision, no small feat even for such experienced cavers. But once they successfully reached the bottom of the cave, the cavers began a careful search for any trace of human remains. They soon found some among a section of mud and debris. The cavers recovered bones, later determined to be human. After extracting strands of DNA from sections of the skull and jawbone, police compared them to samples taken from Eloy's living relatives, and they were a perfect match. After having been missing for almost a quarter of a century, Eloy Cilio Perez had finally been found. When news of the match reached Eloy's 75-year-old daughter, Mercedes, she defied her advanced years to hike out to her father's final resting place to pay her last respects. Her loved ones implored her to await further developments at home, but Mercedes insisted on camping near the cave system's entrance while the subsequent investigations unfolded. She was present when investigators determined that Eloy had been executed by a single shot from a 9mm Astra 400 handgun, the same variety of pistol found in Juan Fernandez Ayala's possession following his sudden and violent death. Throughout the remainder of the summer of 2018, Spanish authorities continued to reconstruct Eloy's skeleton, and it was through this process that they made a chilling discovery. Talal wasn't the only set of human remains that had been left down to rot there in the dark. As investigators began working to reconstruct the second of the two skeletons, several details became evident. The first was that the bones belonged to a female aged 10 to 14 years old when she expired. The second was that the girl hadn't died on the same night as Eloy, but rather between 5 and 15 years later. After analyzing the girl's bones to determine the date of her death, investigators determined that the girl was most probably the child of local shepherds who had accidentally fallen into the cave while working or playing near its entrance. Yet, this claim was quickly dismissed by accomplished forensic anthropologist Dr. Fernando Culia. Dr. Cilio was famous in Argentina for having helped identify almost 100 nameless Argentine soldiers who died in their disastrous attempted takeover of the British Falkland Islands. Then, upon hearing of Cameron Jane Doe, she was generous enough to offer her services to the Spanish government. However, upon performing her analysis of the girl's remains, Dr. Cilio declared the girl could not have been a rural shepherd. Her bone structure suggested that rather than a diet consisting mostly of corn, which would have marked her out as coming from a low-income rural family, the girl had subsisted on high amounts of low-fat animal protein, meaning she was probably raised on the much more populous Cantabrian coast. Dr. Cilio further analyzed the girl's DNA to create a physical depiction of what she might have looked like. She was said to have been around 4 feet 8 inches tall, with green eyes and dark brown hair. This description was then disseminated all over Cantabria in the hopes that it might jog someone's memory, but sadly, no one came forward with any pertinent information. Perhaps the closest investigators came to a definitive break in the case was after learning of a little-known fact regarding the Picos de Europa. Following General Franco's rise to power, many innocent Spaniards simply disappeared. But not all were victims of the fascist secret police, and not all joined the guerrillas in the mountain refuge. Some wished to go off the grid, so to speak, and live out their lives in privacy among Spain's remote, mineral-riddled mountains. Some of these people would have been wanted by Franco's fascists for perceived disloyalty to the regime, while others simply didn't want to live under a dictatorship but couldn't bear to abandon the country of their birth. Most found work as undocumented miners and affiliated mining workers and built their ramshackle housing hidden among the pine-blanketed hillsides. Some would marry, others would have children, but all would remain utterly secluded from the world around them. Therefore, it stands to reason that if one of their community went missing, they would do their utmost to avoid the involvement of outside authorities. A police investigation might uncover far more than just the truth, and for many of Spain's Republican fugitives, such a possibility could not be entertained. Given that less than 20% of the girl's skeleton had been recovered, investigators have been unable to determine the exact cause of her death. Some attempts at analysis have preceded some very strange observations. For example, there's no doubt that the girl fell almost directly down the cave's 180-meter-long entrance shaft before smashing into its rocky floor. Yet only a few of the recovered bones show any signs of high-energy impact damage. The girl's femur and jaw were completely intact, with only small sections of her cranium said to display any significant damage. This has led some to theorize that the girl was murdered via a blow to the head, then somehow placed down in the cave in a way that precludes any kind of prolonged fall. Essentially, there are two competing primary theories here. Number one, the girl's death was entirely accidental and by some physical anomaly only fractured her skull after a nearly 200-meter fall to a hard rocky surface. Or number two, the girl was murdered by someone with so much twisted affection for her that he chose to gently lower her body into the cave in a sick parody of a funeral. As of June of the year 2022, the identity of the topper Jane Doe remains a mystery. And while Spanish police have stated that the investigation is still open, the chances of further developments are highly improbable. Her DNA has since been uploaded to the Phoenix database, a project launched by the Civil Guard in 1999 to help solve cold cases as well as to identify John and Jane Does. Eloy Cilio's remains were eventually returned to his family, and he was laid to rest in the ancient cemetery of the very town he'd given his life to protect. His daughter stated that the topper Jane Doe was also buried in that same cemetery, right next to her father's grave. After they've been so many years down there together in the cave, she said it wouldn't be fair to separate them now.
I'm an icon, man. I'm a girl about a